Hey y'all, welcome to Poli-Side-Eye. We are back again. I'm with my co-host Jared JC Tiger Fan. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm okay. So Trump was acquitted of all charges in inciting an insurrection. I mean, are we surprised?
No, not at all. First off, I'm surprised that you actually said his name. That shocked me that you didn't
I
call
mean, he's no longer in office, so
him.
it's whatever. I can call him 45, I can call him Trump, I can call him asshole, it's
The Republican Party, most of them have a vested interest in what has become known as Trumpism. So they weren't going to do it because there's no political incentive for them to. So you have a few Republicans like Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, who is considered a moderate. I think you could debate that, I guess, relatively. But for most of them, the whole Trumpism thing was for them a political boon. So of course they did what was going to be the most advantageous thing for them. So I wasn't surprised at all.
it all just seemed like a big waste of time. Was it just like a big political pomp and circumstance?
No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't go that far. I do think that there is something to be said about bringing the articles of impeachment to the Senate and just not letting it kind of just fizzle out in the House. I do think that there was a signal sent that there is some degree of commitment to democracy in some way, even though the outcome wasn't conviction. But I do think it was important to kind of signal that. Now, what it will mean for the future is to be seen, but I don't want to necessarily like throw the baby out with the bathwater and say just because we didn't get the outcome we wanted that it was for naught. Like I do think that there was something there.
Look at this growth. I feel like you 5 years ago might have said something different.
I've tried to think about things kind of in totality, and like I'm still very ideological, but I try to contextualize things a bit.
So you heard that Rush Limbaugh passed.
Where's the confetti? I was just waiting for the celebration. Like,
I mean, speaking of that, it made me think: do I want Popeyes tonight or do I want Chinese food?
Right, like this is a celebratory occasion. I mean, it's bad. Like I don't know what you want us to do. Like this man literally spent the last 40 years of his life essentially tearing down Black people, gay people,
Rounding up racists,
women, every category. Like, yeah, exactly. Like, kind of just stoking the flames of racism and xenophobia and every other phobia you can think of. And we're supposed to be, show compassion towards him. No.
Right.
I think there's just a general sentiment in Western culture about not speaking ill of the dead. Like, it's a very, I mean, you see it all the time. It's just like, oh, so-and-so, hey, I know they're going to do it with Trump. It's going to be, oh, he was a conflicted, even though he said some very racially charged things, he incited all of these negative attributes about the country. Ultimately, he was committed to doing things for work. It's coming. Like I mean, he's going to lie.
I swear to God, if I hear Barack Obama or Biden or Kamala, I keep saying Kamala. I'm from New Orleans, y'all. I can't help it. If Kamala says something, or Hillary, I'm gonna be like, now y'all need to stop.
It's gonna happen. Like I'm expecting it because that's what they do. They rehabilitate these figures,
right?
No matter how terrible or how racist, how whatever they were. Like there is something to be redeemed. No, there's nothing to redeem about Donald Trump. There's nothing to redeem about Rush Limbaugh. They were terrible people. Rotten hell. Good riddance.
Oof. Okay. But on to our main topic. So we were talking, I think last week, about neoliberalism, and I really want to know, like, what is a neoliberalist? Neoliberalist. Okay, yeah, that's hard to roll off the tongue. But anyway, am I a neoliberal? And what's the difference between a normal liberal and a neoliberal? And I thought conservatives bad, liberals are good. That's just how I saw it. But I guess just start from the top.
Yeah. So first, let me say I am super excited that we're talking about this because I believe that neoliberalism is one of the ideologies that is destroying most people's lives, whether they realize it or not. So I'm going to do my best to try to walk people through this. It's not easy to do because there's a lot of history. There's a lot of political theory and all kind of other stuff. I'm going to try not to get into that and just try to present it as just very straightforward as we can. So you asked.
I'm sure you're able to do that in a 20-minute span.
So you asked a great question, actually. What is the difference between neoliberalism and liberalism? One thing in America is we have this kind of inverted idea of what liberal is now, because of reasons that I'll talk about later. But so if we take a step back and not think about it in terms of just liberal or conservative and just actually look at what liberalism is. So liberalism is essentially an ideology. So liberal ideology in America is things we are very familiar with. So it is the focus on the individual. So individuals should be free. And so individual freedoms, they should be able to speak as they wish, freedom of speech. They should be able to gather and protest, freedom of assembly. They should be able to worship how they want, freedom of religion, so on and so forth. So that's one of the big kind of components of just classic liberalism. Mm-hmm. The second of which is individuals who are free and have access to property, which government should not be able to kind of intrude on. So if you think about everything you've kind of heard growing up, it's always been about my rights, my property, and that's kind of the current that has been consistent throughout American history. So that's classic liberalism. As you can imagine, there are a lot of contradictions embedded in that. So for instance, slavery was one classic case of liberalism being very contradictory, because a lot of the people who argued in favor of slavery said, well, I have a freedom to own people. Like that isn't, well, they didn't say people because they didn't consider at this time slaves to be people. They considered them to be subhuman, which is the whole notion of race. And they use science to legitimate their inferiority. But you can see that's one example of that being a tension there. There's always kind of these tensions embedded in liberalism. And that's really important to remember when we really define what neoliberalism is. So it's also really important to think about liberalism within the context of capitalism, because they've kind of developed kind of in tandem. So what I mean by that is so much of economic development has been predicated upon these very basic notions of individualism, private property, freedom of insert whatever here. After the Great Depression, capitalism was essentially on its deathbed. During the Depression, Herbert Hoover, who was the president at the time, was essentially like, I mean, it is what it is. Like, if these fucking people, like, if they can't survive, like, that's just capitalism. Like, I mean, they have the right to, I mean, individual right. That means survival of the fittest. That was
the 30s, right?
Late 20s, early 30s, yeah. So he was Hoover is of the belief, like, you know, I realize that shit is kind of bad, but, you know, individualism, like, this isn't really up to me. The government can't really do much about this, like, too bad, too sad. After that, obviously, FDR is elected to succeed Hoover. But then he got in, he was like, oh, shit is like really fucked up. We have to do something about capitalism because it's destroying people's lives. So he passes all of these programs that essentially, the thrust of it was, we recognize that people should have individual liberties and that ultimately the individual is kind of the center of American society. But we also know that capitalism is prone to these booms and busts. So we need to have this kind of strong social safety net to allow people to be individuals.
Was it the New Deal?
Yes. So like the New Deal.
Oh my God.
The New Deal.
Thank you, New Orleans Public School Education. Oh my God, I got one.
Right. So this was essentially a recognition that capitalism in and of itself couldn't function without some type of safety net for people if it went through this cycle of boom and bust, which we knew it would. Obviously, there are a lot of footnotes that we have to remember about the New Deal. A lot of Black people in the South were not eligible to receive a lot of the benefits of the New Deal. So home ownership became a huge thing through the GI Bill, which is a part of the New Deal. Black people were excluded from that. So there is a lot of caveats there that you have to remember. But by and large, that was the ideology. So the ideology at this point was liberalism could only work if we had as a government that was going to essentially secure economic security for people. So they needed economic security to actually be able to enjoy the individual liberties. Are we good?
So this is more, yes, ladies and gentlemen, there will be a pop quiz right after this for you.
I'm trying really hard to be very straightforward, no kind of,
But
jargon.
I always thought liberalism was just more so like, well, being a liberal was just like my ideals, not more so like this definition is more, I guess, tangible, it seems.
So we're getting there. So I'm going to get to that point. So you're getting at liberal as being kind of this principle almost, like your political principles. And so the reason why I really went back before the New Deal was passed is because this is how the term liberal became kind of this principled idea of looking out for other people who might find themselves in a bad position and making sure that people have the roof over their head. All of that idea of liberal kind of really crystallized during kind of this FDR era. So from that point on, liberal took on this meaning of government doing things to ensure the social welfare for its citizens if they find themselves in a situation where they can't provide for themselves. So it takes on kind of this principled notion. So this is the dominant ideology really through the World War II, through the 50s, even Republican presidents like Eisenhower, who was a pretty conservative president, was kind of like, I don't really like all this social program stuff, but that's just the way it is. Like, this is a liberal democracy. This is what we do. Mm-hmm. That just goes to show how prominent this notion was. So obviously 1960s were a very tumultuous decade, and a lot of things happened in the 60s. One was obviously the civil rights movement. In the civil rights movement, one of the things it wanted to call out was this contradiction of liberalism. But then also we had the Vietnam War, which is another huge piece of what was going on in the 60s. And so the government was spending a ton of money on the war. And this is why we end up having all of these huge anti-war movements and things. And so if you remember in last week's episode, we talked about how there was this inflation crisis at the end of the 60s, early 70s. And then as we move into the 70s, inflation just continues to really kind of escalate. What ends up happening is there are a ton of conservatives on the right. What they ultimately used this moment to do was to essentially change the narrative and say, look, government is spending too much. That's why inflation is so high. So really what we need to do is stop letting government be the social safety net for people and let people be the safety net for themselves. So they changed kind of the common sense ideas of the way that we understand housing and education and transportation from things that were social goods to things that the government kind of provided to things that people needed to essentially provide for themselves. And if you couldn't, too bad, too sad. Most of those people who endorsed that view were called neoliberals. The way that neoliberalism really kind of overtook kind of classic liberalism as kind of the dominant ideology was once Reagan, it always comes back to Reagan. They cut welfare, obviously we talked about that. And they essentially cut funding to higher education. And so that's when you saw the explosion of student debt. We talked about that.
Right.
And so all of these other things, this is all a project that took form over the course of like 2 decades. And so the whole point of it was to get people to not think about the government as being a social safety net. In fact, Margaret Thatcher famously said, there is no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. So to get people to think about government as not being a social safety net, but think about themselves as being their own social safety net. So if they don't provide for themselves, they have no one else to blame but themselves.
But it sounds like you're talking about like conservatives though, almost. But conservatives is its own thing.
So neoliberals, some conservatives are neoliberals, but not exclusively. So you have different kind of gradations. So we have kind of neoliberal conservatives, which some people kind of call just like neoconservatives. So these are the people who are also, they believe in small government, all these things, but they also believe that government should be in the business of managing the way that society should be structured. So they believe all the market stuff too, but they also believe, these are the neoconservatives, they believe in the market stuff. They also believe that the government should be keeping together the traditional family. But there's also the neoliberals. So for instance, Bill Clinton was very much a neoliberal. I'm paraphrasing, but he actually said he was going to end welfare as we know it. So it's not just a Democrat-Republican thing. So that's why at the beginning, I really wanted to define what liberalism is itself and outside of this kind of liberal conservative paradigm that we think about.
Well, after hearing that, I feel like maybe I just didn't know what a liberal was, because maybe I'm confusing that with just being just plain old progressive. Maybe I could be a progressive liberal. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but maybe I'm just a progressive. Like, I'm for social programs. I'm for like education being available for all, healthcare. I feel like that's a progressive mindset, you know? So maybe I'm just using the term liberal incorrectly.
So you're not necessarily wrong, but I would say that there are differences between means and ends. Although in your kind of the way that you framed it, you want people to have access to good education, quality healthcare, affordable, and all of these things. But the way that you go about getting there will differ depending on your kind of ideological standpoint. So a lot of neoliberals say that they want these things. Bill Clinton says that he wants everyone to have a good job and have, you know, access to a home and all these other things, but he didn't think that the government should be providing those things. The way that he thought that it should be achieved was by essentially giving people the tools, developing their human capital to essentially prop themselves up. It's very much this kind of like self-help kind of, so that's the way I think about neoliberalism. It's very self-help driven.
Well, that reminds me like, oh yeah, well, you got the same 24 hours Beyonce got.
That's very much a neoliberal kind of mindset, because the whole point, the common current of neoliberalism is that it is all about what the individual is or isn't doing. So if somebody doesn't have a good job, if someone is out in the street, it's not because we have a capitalist system that is relentlessly exploiting people. It's because they didn't wake up at 4 and, you know, rise and grind at 5:30. Like, so that's kind of the idea, but it's ideological. People don't think about it. So the common sense part is really important. And that's why I call it an ideology, because it's not like it's just people are, you know, waking up and saying, oh, I'm neoliberal, so I'm gonna wake up at 5:30 tomorrow so I can rise and grind. Like, it's just, it's conditioned.
Right.
That's a conditioning that has happened over the past 40, 50 years. And this is the last part, and we don't talk about this a lot, but we need to talk about it more. One big thing that neoliberalism did was it turned corporations into people. So what I mean by that is that now many businesses and corporations can now lay claim to the same kind of ideals as people can. So, you know, a corporation has, you know, free speech. They can say what they want. They have access to private property. So if they want to buy up this, you know, this whole neighborhood and essentially gentrify a whole community and displace people, they can do it because it's their right. Or they want to discriminate against. So you remember we had I don't know if you remember, there was a Supreme Court case about a gay couple who essentially wanted to have their wedding cake designed from.
Oh,
this.
Yeah.
Yeah, they lost. The reason they lost is because the court ruled that, well, that cake company is a person and they have rights too, and they have rights. And it was going to be a violation of their freedom of religion. This company, it was going to be their violation of freedom of religion. And so it blurs the lines between individualism and corporatism in a way that has never happened before in modern history. And that's really big because corporate power was already out of control before this era. And now it's just through the roof. So it's really important to focus on the fact that neoliberalism transforms not only individuals, but it transforms corporations and businesses into individuals who have access to individual rights and things just as any other person would. And it's ridiculous because obviously they have way more resources than you have. So if we go to court, who do you think is going to win?
So what are some modern examples of neoliberalism that can be applied to today, you think?
So do you use a dating app? Do you use Tinder?
Yes.
Okay, so let's think about Tinder. What is it doing? Essentially, it is, you remember one thing I told you about neoliberalism is it turns everything into a market. a marketplace, essentially.
Right.
So when you get on Tinder, you're scrolling through. I mean, some people might just look at the pictures. No shade. I mean, but some people actually look at the attributes of the people. So the whole point of Tinder is you're supposed to build this profile that is supposed to essentially show you in a good light. You are marketing yourself on this dating marketplace. So someone will scroll through Tinder, and they were kind of they have look like they got a good job, look like they got a good place. They're not too big, they're kind of cute, but they're maybe a little too old. And so essentially they weigh the pros and cons. That's all neoliberalism, because neoliberalism essentially is turning everyone into a customer at all times, essentially, or a consumer at all times, I should say. And so if you think about that if you stop and think about it, it's actually really ridiculous. Like the notion that we can know everything we need to know about another human being just by what they market to us is a very strange, if you could just really stop and think about it for like 2 seconds, it's a very strange concept.
And then you add the capitalist aspect in. They'll charge me if I want to see who liked me, and they'll charge me if I accidentally scroll past someone, I want to go back, got to charge me for that just to make sure.
Yeah, that's another thing of neoliberalism. It not only does it turn everyone into a consumer at all times, pretty much every dimension of your life, you're now thinking in these very cost-benefit terms. So, that's really what you're doing when you're on Tinder. It's a cost-benefit analysis that's happening instantaneously. So you're looking at the picture. If you don't think they're ugly, then you're going to look at the other materials more times than not. So you're going to say, they're too young, or maybe they're the right age. But then you look at some other stuff. Oh, they kind of said something problematic. I don't know if this is. So you're weighing, again, kind of it's a process of weighing the cost and benefits of whether or not you think this person is worth pursuing. That is, it seems common sense, but this is something that is.
But you don't think that's just like dating in general, though?
So most people, before Tinder and dating apps were a thing, the way that you dated people, think about it. You maybe met someone through a friend, and you actually had a conversation with them, and you maybe got to know them, and then said, oh, not really for me. Or you met them and had a conversation with them and said, oh, wow, like I actually kind of like them, and you got to know them. So essentially, Tinder skips all that. And it's based upon the way that the individual is marketing themselves. So you have to be damn good at marketing. And think about how many times have you felt duped because somebody perhaps marketed themselves with you in a way that you think might be not necessarily the most honest. Again, but the fact that you're even thinking about this in terms of you got a bad deal. It's like you're a customer who bought something and it's not what you ordered. Think about it. It's just
right. And then what about like monetizing things that you're good at? Like if I see someone, oh, you're really good at that, you should try to capitalize off of this. Why not? I feel like if you're good at something, you should be able to profit off of it.
So I think it's a problem not because people are just bad and money hungry and all of these other things, but you have to think about the way that it transforms yourself as an individual. What ends up happening is that when we try to, and this is all about like kind of what we call now the gig economy, like people are always finding new ways to essentially get to secure more and more of their bag. What ends up happening is that where do you have time to actually just do things that are fundamental to you becoming a better person, or things that you just enjoy, like just enjoyment? Yeah, a hobby. I talk to people all the time. I'm just like, what are your hobbies? And they're just kind of like racking their brain trying to think about things that they just enjoy doing because they enjoy doing them. But as soon as you monetize it, it changes the entire way that you approach it. No longer is it about the enjoyment. Now you're doing it because yeah. So I'm not saying that it's a bad thing in of itself, but I do think we have to think about what it's doing to the human psyche. When everything is monetized, when everything is commodified, when everything is about being a consumer, when everything is about money. Yes, the endless, it transforms human subjectivity. It just does. Now, I'm not saying it transforms it in a bad way or a good way. We can debate that. Many people are debating that.
Is that capitalism and neoliberalism, or is it both?
So I think of neoliberalism as being this current kind of iteration of capitalism. And it's the common sense way that people navigate throughout the capitalist order without realizing it. Nobody sits and thinks about when they're scrolling on Tinder that they're, oh my gosh, I'm like acting like a neoliberal capitalist right now. Like, it's just because it's common sense. So that's how I would differentiate the two of them.
So from hearing you say all this about being a neoliberal, I don't think I'm one. Like, I was thinking at the end of this episode, am I neoliberal? And I don't think I am.
I think that there are certain elements of neoliberal ideology that is common sense to you. But I think that's why I said I think most people are may not be neoliberal in every facet of their life, but they absorb some of the neoliberal common sense, not because they think about it, but it's because it's just so common sense. And so, like, when we had the episode when we talked about the university, I was saying that it's common sense now that the role of the university is to go and get a degree and get a good job and go and get exploited at your workplace. Like, no one says that, but that's really what it is. So when you tell people that, oh, I want to major in art history because I derive so much pleasure and satisfaction from learning about these artists from, the 11th century, people look at you like, are you insane? But that's a common sense thing. But the university hasn't always been thought of as just a breeding ground or a work factory. Like, this is a relatively new phenomenon. So again, that's an example of many people being neoliberals without realizing it. Part of it is not their fault. Part of it is because we live in an economy now where you kind of have to pick and choose everything, a cost-benefit analysis. So you're not going to go and major in philosophy when you have $50,000 in student debt. So you're going to major in, I don't know, econ or pre-law or somewhere where you can go and potentially make tons of money. Not because you want to do that, but because, again, everything has been transformed into a cost-benefit analysis at all times. That is the biggest kind of attribute of neoliberalism, is the fact that everything now is about a cost-benefit analysis.
Well, thank you for explaining that in 20 minutes. I'm pretty sure you have a whole entire thesis on this.
Yes, so this is actually very foundational to my dissertation. I spent a ton of time doing the intellectual history, if you will, of neoliberalism. So if anybody wants to know more, feel free in the comments if there's something you want me to clarify or expound upon. I will offer book suggestions or links to academic talks or things that I think might be useful if you're interested. But I tried to be as succinct as I could. It was really hard.
Well, this is going to be fun to edit, so we'll see how it comes out. Well, I want to dedicate this last segment to Houston and Ted Cruz. Now, shout out to Houston. I hope everyone is doing well. The light is at the end of the tunnel. Like, I heard it's going to be like 60, 70 degrees next week. Do you have friends and family in Houston?
I do, actually, and Dallas. And Dallas got hit even harder than Houston did. So they were without power for a few days, no running water, all of that stuff. But most of them have power again and water. But yeah, it was pretty bad.
Right. And do you think that because Texas was a red state that it went through this, or, you really can't stop global warming at all? Like, was it any of this political to you?
So I would push back and say that you can't stop global warming. We could have done things to slow global warming, and we chose not to. Mm-hmm. Remember, we talked last episode when Jimmy Carter gave a speech to America in 1978, I believe it was, essentially saying the climate crisis was essentially the crisis that we faced as a country moving forward. And people are like, you fucking weakling, like, who cares? America, yeah. So we knew that this was coming. So it's not as though this is some grand surprise. Texas in particular is just the most, so Texas is actually kind of a neoliberal haven. So if we stop and really think about all of the states that are the fastest growing right now, and so it really annoys me when people are like, oh, well, Texas is just growing because they have great jobs and the weather is great and you can get so much bang for your buck and all this other stuff. They say the same thing about Florida and all. So the fastest growing states in America right now are Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Arizona, all what has become known as the Sun Belt states, that people then say, oh, they just do it because they have a good economy. Yeah, well, there's a reason they have a good economy. It's because they are business-friendly states. So they're low regulation, low taxes, anti-union. And so companies flock to these states because they can essentially have access to as much land as they want, fuck the environment, can essentially not, they don't have to provide healthcare to their workers. And so they can exploit. So these places end up being the type anti-government. So they don't have to worry about the state government putting their hands in their business. And so places like Texas, these states that just latch onto, these anti-regulatory strands are the worst suited to handle crises like this because their government does not exist to actually do things for their residents. It exists to prop up business. Last I read, I believe they have more uninsured people than any other state in the country, which is by no accident, as I told you. So think about all the people that probably had to go to the hospital because of frostbite or other things like that. I mean, obviously it's going to be disproportionately poor and working people who already wouldn't have access to healthcare. So Texas is just uniquely not suited to address these big kind of ecological crises. But it's by design. Like that's what Texas's bread and butter is. And so we can't necessarily be surprised that this shit is happening because Texas essentially gives carte blanche to all these companies to do whatever the fuck they want with impunity.
And I'm sure with leaders like Ted Cruz, it doesn't help the situation any further. Like, I think he's literally like the human definition of like a douchebag.
Yeah, he is. But I tweeted yesterday, I was saying that because I saw a few people saying, oh, he's going to have to pay when he runs for re-election. I'm like, Ted Cruz is not going to pay for anything. First off, he's not up for re-election until 2024. Nobody's going to remember any of this by then. He just got re-elected a couple of years ago. Like, no one's going to, yeah, he's not up. His Senate is a 6-year term. He just got re-elected in 2018. He's not going anywhere. But beyond that, like most of his constituents don't expect him to do anything because the Republican MO has been government doesn't do anything. So why would you expect anything of your government officials when the whole reason you voted for them is because you wanted them to stay out of it? And so I don't think he's going to face any backlash for it because he knows that his constituents don't care. And so he can, be essentially the liberal media can flagellate them until the cows come home, but it won't really matter because
he's still there for X amount of years.
Exactly.
Oh man.
I try to not make it, but don't get discouraged because when you lose hope, that's exactly when the ruling class sweeps in and does whatever the fuck they want.
He just has that face that you just want to knock out.
Yeah, he does have a pretty deplorable face.
But we've reached the end of our time. So what book would you like to nominate for people to look up?
First, I want people to know that don't give up hope. I know it's easy to do, but don't. But the book that I would recommend is, in light of this conversation we've been having about not only neoliberalism, but capitalism, I would recommend this book, which is called Talking to My Daughter About the Economy or How Capitalism Works. It's actually a really, really good book because obviously, as the title suggests, he writes in a way that I believe she's like 13, can understand. So he talks about capitalism in ways that are very accessible to people. He doesn't use a lot of jargon. I mean, because capitalism is hard to understand. I mean, let's be honest about it. It is not an easy concept to grasp. There's a lot of moving parts. There's history, all of these other components as we've discussed. And so he talks about it in a way that that I think is really digestible. So that's the name of the book, if people are interested.
And it will be in the description below as well. Let everyone know where they can follow you or ask you these complex questions that I have for you all the time.
I just have to first wipe my brow because that was really tough to explain neoliberalism in 20 minutes.
Hopefully they got something from it.
Hopefully I explained that in a way that was halfway coherent. But anyway, if people want to follow me, JAYC Tiger Fan on both Twitter and Instagram.
All right. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram, CDIGGI1. Please make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe, and share. Probably won't be doing one next week because I'm moving, but we will get with you the week after that. So yeah, we will see y'all later. Bye.